What I wanted to talk about today were individual development plans. How many of you have done one? Okay. Have you ever heard of them? Those of you who haven't done it, you sort of know maybe not sure you need to do it. Okay. Okay. So individual development plans came into the fore about 20 years ago, largely in postdoctoral training, to help postdocs kind of make plans for what they were doing in the postdoc, because there's no academic curriculum in a postdoc, as there is in graduate school. And so there was this sense that you could be a postdoc for a long time, and it was hard for you to set goals, and it was hard for your PI to set goals. So FASET 20 years ago set up an individual development plan, and that idea of helping you focus on what your own skills are and what you want to learn next, and having programming to assist with that, has now blended right into the graduate student programs. And now it's an expectation that each graduate student also fills out and updates an IDP. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what they are, how to do it, and how it's going to affect you. So some of you are graduate students, and if you look at this, you say, what are my professional goals for this year? So you're a first-year student. Your professional goal might be find a research mentor, for example. So one of you said you were a third-year graduate student. What would be a goal that you would have this year?
Maybe reach out to, what is it, like an interview, informational interview?
Do an informational interview and learn about a career. Some of you might say, I need to publish a paper this year. I'm hoping some of you are saying, I might want to write a fellowship application. You're all at different stages, and you all have different skills, and you're all seeking slightly different things. Your mentors may or may not know that, right? The second part, after we think about goal setting, is how are your activities related to those goals? So if you actually sat back and reflected on the goals you had for this year, then what do you do when somebody says, well, I want you to head up this student group on the parking situation? Well, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe that's not consistent with your goals. Maybe it is consistent with your goals. How do you relate your activities? And this is more than just courses or working in the lab with the kinds of goals that you have. So you mentioned an informational interview. That's really important for learning about career goals and sectors. And it's not necessarily more hours at the bench. And it leads you to the third piece, which is, do you need more information to achieve your goals? So I don't know how many of you think you would like to go into academia. You want to give me a raise of hands on that? How many think you might want to go into biotech or industry research? How many of you want to work at the NIH? Or slightly related. How many of you are thinking about a career in science editing?
It's an alternative for me.
Okay, so each of you have a variety of, how many are thinking about a teaching career? Okay, so each of you have slightly different goals, and we know they're going to change over time. And we need to help you get the information you need about next steps in your training. How many of you think you're going to have to do a postdoc for your career? This has become a really animated area, right? You don't need a postdoc for a lot of careers, and yet sometimes we delay the planning until we are in the postdoc, and that can cause some difficulties. So the real point in an IDP is to begin to think about what your goals are. This is a very personal thing. Begin to assess what your skills are, and begin to think about whether you have access to the information you need to begin to take action on them. Now for graduate students, you have some sort of typical activities. So in the first and second years, you're what they call a probationary recruit. Your relationship actually is quite different with the university. So you're going to have to take classes and get grades, you're going to have to rotate, you're going to have to find a thesis advisor, you're going to start to build some research skills and achieve some pilot data, maybe, but you're still rotating. You're going to take some kind of candidacy exam or qualifier. So if you were a second year student, you might have passed my qualifier as one of the goals you had that year. You might have attending a national meeting to present data, I don't know. When you're really in the depths of doing your research as a doctoral candidate, you're really building research skills and you're really building pilot data. Here, ideas and goals like publishing academic papers might come into play. presenting at conferences, applying for fellowships, etc. But then somewhere in there is this idea that you might graduate, maybe after like 5-ish years, I don't know. And then there's this little problem called, what are you gonna do after that? Usually that what are you gonna do after that doesn't rise in your mind until you can see that you're gonna get out, right? So maybe around the 3rd year, you start thinking, what am I gonna do next? And this helps you to begin to plan. A postdoc has a much more general activity here. You come into a postdoc because you found a research advisor, you think you're gonna learn a lot of new things, this is terrific. A postdoc is a transient position, right? So this is not, you're not a postdoc forever, I hope. What are you really doing and how do you plan your years as a postdoc? So we're thinking you're learning new research skills, you're making new pilot data, now you really are under some interest in publishing academic papers. You're presenting at conferences, I hope you're applying for research fellowships, and most institutions, this thing called postdoctoral fellow is transient and it ends at the end of 5 years. Then what are you gonna do? So unfortunately, the then what are you gonna do part continues in as a postdoc. And in some cases, it's even more disorienting, right? So I guess I wanna focus on this idea that is really about you and your agency. That is, how much drive you have to do various parts of this program. The timing really depends on you. So there's no question that you could do this. You're smart enough to do this. That's why you got in the program in the first place. What's really tough about both grad school and postdocs is there's no one telling you what to do. They're not telling you what to do. Think about the relationships you have with your mentor. They're like, oh, you might explore that, or think about talking to so-and-so, or read that paper, but they're not giving you a lot of direct guidance, and that's kind of the point, right? But it can be incredibly frustrating because you don't know what's coming next, and you don't know if you're getting the skills that you need for your own goals. So it's more true with graduate students, but sometimes with postdocs, sometimes you flounder waiting for someone to tell you what to do. Maybe your committee will tell you what to do. What I think we want to do is sort of change that understanding to say, you need to take charge of your career and you need a plan. And what we're doing here is helping you achieve that, okay? So we're putting you back in the driver's seat on both of these things. You may not feel like you're prepared for that. So you need a plan. The individual development plan is a way to come up with that plan. It's incredibly useful. You will, I think in the end of today, you're gonna say, boy, that was a lot of work, but it's a lot of work you can do, you know, while you're at home or at a different time, when you have a little bit of reflective time, and then begin to think about how to implement it when you come back. We're gonna talk about each of these sections today. I'm using some of the slide information from a website called My IDP. And in fact, as we'll show you in a minute, My IDP offers you an ability to have a password protected IDP that you can update as often as you like. And the one reason I like this website, you can do IDPs on a piece of paper, that's easy enough. But the reason I like this website is it links to AAAS careers. So it's a way for you if you say, well, I'd like to work in government and policy, and I don't really know how to get the training I need to do that. The links in My IDP to science careers are really strong. So they're a place that you can learn more about the careers you're kind of thinking about. The other thing I like about My IDP is it's going to take your answers to questions, and it's going to say, your answers closely match people who are doing this job, that job, the other job, which can be really helpful, right? So if you're really not sure how you're going to do it, it helps a little bit to have that connection. We're going to talk a little bit today about self-assessment, career exploration, setting goals, and implementing the plan. I talked today with a number of faculty, and I'm probably coming to each of your departments to talk about the implement plan part with your research mentors. So they know right now you're ahead of them, okay? But I think that everyone's on board with trying to help you get these done. So let's break it down a little bit. How many of you have ever done like a Myers-Briggs interest inventory? Okay, so that's good. There are a lot of ways you can do self-assessment. That one is a little bit about what's your comfort zone for, what's your personality preference for how you solve problems. Do you like to solve problems in a big group? Do you like to solve problems with reflection and then action? People are different, right? Your Myers-Briggs is one way to assess the way you like to address problems. Have any of you done any other kinds of self-assessments? Well, now you get to do a big one. It's actually pretty interesting and pretty revealing. If you go to the My IDP site, you can create your own first-time user password protected thing. I can't see it, your mentor can't see it, it's something that just exists to you. You can print out sections of it and share it with your mentor, and in fact, we can talk a little bit about how to do that later. But really, this is all about you. So this is a chance for you to go in, do some assessments, think about what you're up to, and then share portions of it as you feel like you want to. You can also do the paper IDP that started with FACET if you like, but I kind of like this one. Yes, it's another username and password, but it's one that you could update every year through your postdoc if you wanted to. I mean, it's really up to you. So I would suggest taking a look at this and thinking about it. So we know nationally that IDPs lead to much greater success, both of graduate students and postdocs. And that's part of the reason why I think we're trying to promulgate this approach, which really depends on you doing all the hard work, okay? We know that people who use IDPs and their strategies to pursue career-specific goals achieve greater success as measured by salary, promotions, and level of responsibility. They report greater satisfaction. I think that's related to the idea that you have more agency. You are in control of it, so you don't feel like things are happening at you, right? That you're driving the train. It may not go the way you want it to, but you are making choices and driving the train the direction you would like. More satisfaction, publish more papers, and had fewer conflicts with advisors. This is actually really important. Your relationship with your research advisor changes a lot from the first year when you're rotating to your dissertation when everything is bright and beautiful to the very end where it can get kind of rough. And then you leave and that person becomes a letter of reference. So your relationships can change a lot. They can be incredibly important to what you're doing, but they're likely to be long-lived in your careers. So having a good relationship with your advisor is a really important issue. And we'll talk about that in other sessions. So we think that IDPs are going to actually make your life better. How do you get started? It turns out that GW has a Center for Career Services. I didn't know that. They have a number of self-assessment tools, including Myers-Briggs and several of the other ones. It's worth checking out. I'm actually trying to understand better who's going to be assigned to us to facilitate graduate student and postdoc relationships with hiring agents in the area. Seems that most of their work, like many of the ones that are focused on undergrads, are really looking at regional recruiting. But if you think about our regional recruiting, that includes the NIH, it includes the Rockville Technology Corridor, it includes adjacent institutions. So take a look in there, and I will come back to you about that. Maybe I'll have them come over and lead one of the sessions about how they can help grad students and postdocs. In the My IDP session, you actually have separate assessments for skills, values, and interests, which sound like the same thing. And I'm not going to make you memorize this, you can't even see it. This one is a values assessment. How important is it to you from 1 to 5 to contribute to the betterment of the world? That drives a lot of people, maybe it's not so important. How important is it that you work in a congenial atmosphere with friendly colleagues? I hope that's important. Influence people, are acknowledged as an expert, and so forth. This is really asking about your personality, right? And what's important to you in a career, right? And it's not going to be the same for each of you. It's going to be different. So, and it also goes on right off the page. So in each of these sections here, you're going to have some quick tips to do the assessment, your assessment where you rate it, and you'll get a summary at the other end. You may find it kind of fun to explore this as you look at it. Oh, this is printed up sideways. You're then going to be asked about building scientific skills and core competencies. And I have a handout here that was developed from the National Postdoc Association that is similar to the one that's turning out crooked. But it allows you to think right this minute, if you had to assess right this minute, whether you have done, let's say, designing a testable hypothesis. Have you done it a little bit? You completed a workshop on how to do that? Have you performed it with supervision? Have you performed it all by yourself? Have you taught that skill? And as you go down, it's two-sided. As you go down the components, it asks you to rate yourself and whether you've had experience with a variety of professional skills, okay? You'll be prompted to do this within the IDP site. And I wanted to give you this because you can begin to think about it. In the IDP site, you're sort of rated 1 to 5. I've given you a couple of ways to think about what 1 might look like and what 5 might look like, right? 5, you're an expert, you've taught it to other people. 1, maybe you had a class in that thing, okay? So all along the way, you're becoming more competent at that skill, right? So in graduate school, it seems kind of obvious that you're learning new skills, right? So maybe you've never written an abstract by yourself. Well, you would work on that with your advisor and maybe other people on the team, you'd write an abstract. As a postdoc, you've probably written an abstract before and now you're doing it by yourself, right? So you're having a higher competency at that research skill, for example. So this is a nice way for you to think about, right this minute, based on all the experiences you've had, you're going to rate yourself as more or less expert in these research skills that are essential for a biomedical research career, right? I put on here teaching. Some people are interested in a teaching career, and in fact, you aren't required to teach for most of our programs. So if you wanted to do that, how would you get any teaching experience, right? So we can get you into environments where you get teaching experience, but we can't do that if we don't know that's something you want to do, right? So this is it gives you a really good way to have a conversation with your mentor, your thesis advisors, the people on your committee, colleagues down the hall, right? This gives you a very good way to find out more about particular research skills and careers themselves. So this is just the diagram that I just gave to you. So it's not a surprise that many PhD programs work to build scientific skills. So here it lists things like scientific knowledge, research skills, professionalism, and so forth that correspond to the same things that are on the National Postdoc Association, right? It makes a lot of sense that they would be correlated with each other. But in fact, we don't have those goals in postdoc programs at all. So you're a little bit at sea from that. One of the key pieces that we're hoping that you do as a grad student, and not only as a postdoc, is to think about what you're going to do next, right? That next after 5 years part. This can be something you want to put off, right? If you look at a lot of students, they're like, I'll deal with that later. I don't know how much you make. I don't even know where to look for the job. Am I any good? All of those things come to the fore. This is the AAAS career website that I think you may end up spending a lot of time in. Some of you who apply for the government are going to have to learn how to navigate through USA Jobs, and we can have a session on how to do that. FASEB has professional development resources. All of these have vignettes of people in different kinds of jobs and have the ability to understand what the job duties are for different people. I had a lot of friends when I was going through graduate school and postdoc who ended up in biotech industry. And one of the things, at least this is a long time ago, the things that was shocking about that is in many industry positions, you don't publish scientific papers. In fact, most of what you do is proprietary. So where you had been trained to write these scientific papers and talk about your research, you actually, in that job, had a very different focus on the products of your research. So you kind of need to know that as you think about where you're going in careers. Many industrial positions really want you to have some experience with working in teams. It's not the same thing as working at the bench and getting your dissertation done. So as you begin to think about what the job duties are in careers, it's helpful for you to say, well, I know how to do this, but I don't have any experience with this part. I need to work on that part. It can be useful to look up job descriptions. So somebody says, oh, I have this job doing a particular career. Look at the job description and see if any of those words make sense to you as the kinds of things you want to learn next, right? So having a destination makes it a lot easier to plan to get there. And the problem is that emotionally it can be kind of difficult to be thinking, what's that destination going to look like, right? And talking about it. So career exploration is really important. I understand the Postdoc Association yesterday had a career panel of people who worked in government, both as scientists and as administrative positions. And I know that both they and the IBS program have more career vignettes, individuals doing particular careers. We can also connect you to alumni from our programs who are in careers in this area. Either have them come back or have you go shadow them, right? In thinking about what careers would be like. So it is part of what we all do in training ourselves as a scientist. And we also know that your ideas are going to change, and that's perfectly okay. Right? These are your ideas. You learn more and you may change your direction somewhat. So the IDP will provoke you to go and do some career exploration. Maybe because you say, I never want to do that, but these 5 things are still part of the game, right? Even as you narrow it down a little bit. The NIH actually looked very hard at the career outcomes of people who earned PhDs in the United States. And I believe that this was done in 2008. It included 128,000 people who earned a PhD in the United States in biomedical sciences, so from everywhere. And they said, once you're out of training, past a postdoc, if that was part of your program, what career sectors were you in? So it's looking at everybody in the most recent years in the United States. And there are some really interesting things about the career outcomes. They were published in the advisory committee to the director, the Biomedical Research Working Group, and you can look it up for more detail. In that report, they found that about 43% were involved in academic research or teaching. How many of you have heard a different number for that? Yeah? What have you heard?
4%.
Okay, what have you heard?
Sorry?
10%.
Pardon me?
10 to 15%.
10 to 15%. So FASA, one of the other societies that I mentioned, suggests somewhere between 13 and 23% have a tenure track academic position. This number includes people who have a primarily teaching position, for example, at an undergraduate campus, a liberal arts campus. So they are absolutely doing academic research, but they're more teaching intensive. So this number looks bigger than some of the numbers you see that dissect that apart. As we think about these outcomes going further, you also have to recognize that this thing we call tenure is also changing and going away, at least at some extent, with rolling contracts becoming more normal, okay? But that's why this number seems really big. So in this case, it's 43%. Are in academic research or teaching. 18% are in industry research, not sales, not product development, research. So this would be biotech at Biogen or Regeneron or some Athersys, something like that. 6% are in government research, that is at the NIH, the FDA, something like that. 18% are in science-related non-research. So they might be running the Genetics Society. They might be running a science museum. This is a kind of a catch-all for a lot of things. And in this particular analysis, this would include people who were no longer at the bench in industry, but were now vice president for research. They're not doing any research themselves anymore. So this particular analysis was, what are you doing with your hands, right? So it's a sad truth. Well, it's a sad truth that as you rise up in academia or in government and research, you go from being the person who gets all the really cool data as a postdoc, as an assistant professor, and then you start mentoring others to be successful, which is really exciting, but often you have some conflict with doing as much research on your own, right? So as you become more successful, you fall into this other science-related non-research section, which is, probably should say right. 13% are in non-science. They have nothing to do with science. They might have gone into law. Patent attorneys would fall into this section, even though there's some science in there. These are people who've gone into science editing would count in this particular classification. 2% are unemployed. So the really good news is this 2% has stayed the same for decades. Right? You have a PhD in biomedical sciences, you're going to have a job. And in fact, you're probably going to have the job you want. But between here and there are a whole lot of decisions and training. So one of the things that was really interesting in this report, which is now, it was almost 10 years ago, was that a whole lot of our research mentors had been saying to graduate students and postdocs for the last legion years, you have to get my job, and the way to do that is to get a fellowship, and then they're gonna look for whether you got an R01, and that's the way to success. And this led to a fair amount of conflict with graduate students and postdocs who said, I didn't want that job. That's not a job I want. I want to do a different job. How do I learn how to do that? Because you don't do that job. And how do I get those skills? And sometimes the faculty member would feel like he or she was being measured by whether you went on to get an R01 and do other things. And so sometimes that was a bit of an itchy situation. One of the things that was really important in this particular assessment was that a relatively small number of people were ending up in academic research. Many were ending up in teaching. But in fact, this is the only career sector that would apply for an R01. So counting people by whether you went on to earn an R01 was really underestimating the people who were contributing to the scientific enterprise. So that was an interesting thing for the NIH to realize, and probably for your faculty mentors to realize. So here's this huge assessment done with some sort of interesting criteria for what people are doing. And this is what it is at GW. So we have been reporting, and I can give you the last 3 cohort years of what people who earn a PhD at GW go on to do after their postdoc, if they did a postdoc. And this is from people who earned a PhD from 2005 to 2009. So I can give you the last 15 years, but many of the ones from 2009 to 2014 are still in postdocs. But we have those data, we'll share those data with you. When you look at the post-training jobs, 28% were in academia, and we can tell you where they are. 13% are in government nonprofit, 5% in communication, 30% in industry research, 10% in business, which is the sales or product development, 3% policy, 5% admin, 3% have changed and gone into medicine, clinical medicine, so they went and got a second degree. So this may or may not reflect your PhD class or the classes that you came from if you're now doing a postdoc. This is a lot higher than the national statistics in government and nonprofit. It's a little bit lower in academia overall. And industry and business, for as long as we've looked at it at GW, have hovered in this relatively large proportion. I suspect these numbers are heavily influenced by our location in DC, right? The NIH is up the street. The Rockville corridor is up the street. So we have access, the federal government is right here. So we have access to a whole lot of positions that would not be commonly found in other locations. And I suspect that many of you are thinking, well, maybe I could do that job because it's right here. GW has a lot of grads who go into NIH, probably because it's 20 minutes away. So we're looking very hard at what the PhD alumni careers are. I would love to do the same thing for the postdocs. So if you hear from me by email, I think you'll answer me as I look at where people are, because these form alumni networks for you. They help you understand what the careers are really like. This is somebody who understands whether the GW education led to success in their job. It's super important for us to understand, right? So the third part of your IDP is to set some goals. And here you're looking at career fit. So this is a place where you start to match the kinds of skills that you have right now and what you would like to do with your ultimate career goal, and begin to think about how you're going to get those things achieved. What sort of activities or experiences will make you a good candidate? And I know you can't see it, but in this section, in the My IDP section, it says, my career path matches. Based on what you entered into your skills and values assessment and what you thought you wanted to do, this will give you a sense of whether your skills match a particular career, and whether your interests match a particular career. I was just looking at, I forgot what the number is, but I was looking at a large number of people with these jobs. So principal investigator in a research intensive institution, research and industry, research staff, combined research and teaching career, teaching intensive, science education for K through 12, clinical practice, public health related, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are almost 20 different career paths that are segregated here. Some of them are obviously not on the screen. And this isn't telling you what you have to do by any stretch, but it's telling you that people with the skills and the interests that you've described earlier are often found in those kind of positions. And that maybe if it says, oh, you might be interested in doing this, maybe that's what you actually would be interested in, right? So if it turns out that you've been saying, I really want to go into teaching K through 12, and all of your skills and interests are saying, no, go be a PI in a research intensive institution, maybe you'll take this seriously, right? You're not gonna be 100% in any of these things, but it's giving you an idea about the kinds of careers you might want to explore, whether your skills are really matching those. You can imagine some of these skills require people skills or not people skills, right? We all know people in the lab who are like mensches, and we know people in the lab who are just gonna get it done, right? You're taking your whole personality to your career. So it's worth looking at this and saying, well, maybe I should take more seriously thinking about scientific and medical testing as a career. Diagnostics. So this is an interesting piece. This is, by the way, something you see, I don't see, your mentor doesn't see, can be done in the quiet of your apartment, and allows you to think about what possible careers there are. One of the things as you hit this section for the grad students that I really want you to take seriously is beginning to discover whether you need a postdoc to do that career. So there's a lot of lore around this issue, and not everybody should do a postdoc, and not every job is looking for a postdoc. So this is a place for grad students that you'd like to do this before you graduate, so that you begin to think about, do I need a postdoc for this position, or maybe I don't, right? They then give you a wide variety of hints and skills for developing research skills or career skills. So they generally focus on getting training, practicing that thing, and getting feedback on it. So that's easy to understand in something like teaching, right? So you say, I'd like to go into K through 12 teaching. Well, it'd be good if you learned anything at all about educational theory. That seems obvious. Then you should be able to practice it. My daughter, who's a piano performance major, says this thing called guided practice is really important in her field. And if you think about it, that's what we do in the lab all the time. You have guided practice. So you're not out there by yourself doing this, but you're acquiring some skills, and then you need to get some feedback. Did you do well? Do you need to work on another section? How did you like it, right? So these are pieces that you need to work on. There are a whole lot of little tips here about your summary, and it will tell you a whole lot of information, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the implement the plan part. And if you looked at that original slide and you look at this one, you'll see that it goes right back again in the circle to self-assessment. So here you are, you assess yourself, you set some goals, you learn some more, you begin to implement it, which we'll talk about in a minute, and doing that may give you more information about yourself. You may say, I'm really lousy at teaching and also it terrifies me. So I'm gonna go back and rethink some of this, right? It's okay to go back and review that as part of a cycle. Most people recommend that you update your IDP every year. In some cases, things might happen and you wanna do it every 6 months. This is entirely up to you, right? But yearly, if you think about your resume, you're probably updating things every 6 months to a year. Right, if you get a paper out or you completed something, that's about the right kind of timing. But nothing prevents you from doing it weekly if you'd like to. But this is a piece I think we need to talk a little bit about. So this was news to your advisors. The NIH set a requirement 3 years ago that if your PI was funded by the NIH, whether you're a grad student or a postdoc, they had to report how IDPs were being used for students associated with the grant. Okay, it falls into a particular section that they have in their annual report on the grant. And in fact, I've just talked to quite a few people here who said, what? So we're going to help your faculty advisors think about how to do this. If you are on an NIH fellowship, you need to have completed an IDP, and they're going to ask about how it's being used. And I was just talking to a postdoc who wrote an American Heart Association fellowship postdoc. Part of the application was completing an IDP. So people are taking this pretty seriously, and yet if you think about it, you're the only one who knows the answer, right? You did this by yourself. So your advisor needs to understand that you have done an IDP, and you need to think a little bit about how you want to share the information from that IDP with him or her. Yeah?
So I was wondering, does the IDP indication of the postdoctoral fellow in the lab anyhow influence the final granting situation? Because say the postdoc is interested more in non-science, research-oriented industry job,
Yep.
and NIH doesn't really fund for it.
Right.
So how would NIH look at that?
It's a great question, okay? So part of the reason why, so at no time should you be asked to give somebody your IDP and say, see, this is what I secretly believe, right? That's not the point of this tool. This tool is to help you understand better what you want to do and begin to take steps to do that. There was, from those funny numbers I showed you before, for some time, concerns among grad students and postdocs who wanted a non-science career, or sometimes even one in industry, was considered somehow not as good. And actually talking about it honestly with their mentors. I don't know if you've had any experiences here that would suggest that that's not a problem or that it remains a problem in some environments. But part of the reason why no one turns in the IDP to your thesis committee, to your postdoc advisor, to the NIH, is to get around this issue called, if I don't like your career choice, then I'm not going to invest in you, in whatever way you want to think about it. So, no, your NIH investigator is never going to say, and she told me she's going to work in museum studies. It's not even in here. All they're saying is your institution encouraging students and postdocs to reflect on what they'd like to do and assisting and providing the resources to do it, right? So I think that the way that piece is implemented is really good, right? You can begin to think that you might want to have some of those conversations with your research mentor. We should talk about that a little bit. So there's some tips for how faculty might use the IDP. And the most important one here that I'm promulgating with your research mentors is that you need to discuss your training opportunities in a separate scheduled private meeting distinct from the lab meeting. They're really the biggest strength in an IDP is that it's an excuse. If you haven't had this conversation already, it's an excuse to have a conversation with your advisor about what you really want to do with your career and how you might get there. Sometimes with some advisors, it happens every week, right? And they're busily sending you off to professional meetings to meet their friend who does whatever it is the thing is you want to do. In other environments, there may be tensions about, I want to do a non-science career, I think my advisor's not going to go for this, and maybe he won't send me to the meeting, right? So the IDP is an incredibly important place to have a private conversation with your mentor to talk about what you want to do. You're in charge of that conversation, right? You're in charge with how much you share. You're in charge with how much you ask for, if you will, okay? You're in charge of your own career. So I think there are still some sensitivities about this issue with some research mentors, to be very honest with you, and you may know that's true in your environment or not. So I want to talk a little bit about how you might want to think about implementing your IDP, right? Because we're in the real world here. These are some things we're talking with faculty about. One of the things that's been incredibly interesting, the NIH funded 17 universities around the country for the last 5 years in what's called the BEST program, the Broadening Enrichment Scientific Training, something like that. And they gave them a pile of money and said, tell me what kind of programming you're going to do to allow graduate students and postdocs to explore non-academic careers. It's quite obvious that your faculty mentors are in an academic career. They're going to give you a lot of advice about academic careers, and they're going to know not so much about the other ones. So how do we get institutions to develop the kinds of resources you need to explore non-academic careers? You can't really ask your faculty advisor to be an expert on that. He or she might know people who do it, but maybe not, right? So what was really interesting is that at the beginning of that program, there was a lot of nervousness about students and postdocs being honest with their advisors about their career goals, but this nervousness that if I'm not going to get an R01, you know, they'll just stop paying attention to me or something like that. And it turned out really not to be true. The faculty were nervous about what they would report to the NIH, right? But in fact, their relationships with their trainees were pretty normal. So that's a good thing. But we can talk a little bit more about what the concerns might be in sharing some of that. This is information for the GW faculty about how to answer that section I told them they had to answer, which they didn't know they had to answer, but they're gonna have to answer it. And this is just some final resources for career advice. So what I'd like to do is encourage you today to go look at that MyADP site. Think about creating a username and password. Think about going and completing the skills assessment. Do this in a place where you have some time, because it's asking all these things that you maybe have to think about a little bit. Start to plug through it and see what you discover. When you discover that GW doesn't have any resources to train you in the 27th career that you found that you really want to do next, let me know, because we'll try and find a way to do that. But one of the biggest goals that I have for my office is making sure you have access to whatever information or resources you need to be successful at these careers. I also want you to have access, if you're a grad student, to really understanding whether you do or don't have to do a postdoc next. Okay, right? Sometimes these issues can be touched by immigration status, and I want to be honest about that. This is a place where I think in the current climate things are even more nervous. And if you run into issues there, I'm happy to talk with you further about it. But I know that my own students who were, for example, from China, were nervous about making sure that I was happy, so they were happy, so they were going to get this academic career they imagined that I wanted them to do, and they weren't going to tell me anything else. And that conversation can get very convoluted, right? So where you can approach being as honest as you can, I would suggest you try to do that, okay? It's your career, it's your whole life. So if you run into questions about it, I am very happy to help you with it. If you think we should talk a lot about how to have a conversation with my IDP and my mentor, you can print just the summary. Doesn't say anything at all about your ideas about values and skills. You just print a summary. You could say, I've done this IDP thing and I'd like to learn more about a particular career sector. Your advisor might know people or not know people there. We might have alumni who are there. We might be able to link you to particular societies. So a lot of societies are now dealing with career outcomes. Maybe you're seeing that at your professional meetings, right? But go home, try it out. No one knows if you did it, and think about how you would deploy this with your advisory committee. What would be useful for them to know about your goals? Could they form career mentors for you? Do you use, for example, informational interviews to try and find people in career sectors that you weren't aware of? How do you build the skills you realize you don't even have, right? How do we do that? So that's a piece of the formalism that I'm ready to be done with, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about